in the coal mines and in the mountains. It's got even more of the ingredients of great history than they had in the Wild West. And yet America looks at the Wild West as one of the glorious parts of its history and then looks aside when the same kind of thing happens in West Virginia. West Virginia's history is, I think, more distinctive, more unusual, richer. I think it's a great history that West Virginians won't even acknowledge.
We could sense, just beyond our broken-down fences, the great reach of the American continent. Because the land kept us, we held to our pioneer ways the longest, the strongest. And we saw the passing of time from a place called solid. Louise McNeil.
World War I brought the world to West Virginia and West Virginians into the world. Farmers and factory workers left home as soldiers, 60,000 in all, including nearly 200 Army nurses. In Wheeling, steelmakers worked around the clock, filling military contracts. A new chemical industry mushroomed in the Kanawha Valley, producing mustard gas and high explosives. But the resource most critical to the war effort was coal. As demand soared, miners were exempted from the draft. Union leaders called on coal operators to join them in a united front.
There must be no laggards, no frivolous quibblings. We must stand shoulder to shoulder in this great battle for liberty and democracy. Franchini.
During the war, state membership in the UMWA soared from 6,000 to 53,000. But in the southern coal fields, the Union made little progress.
During the war, there was demand for everybody's coal, and there was no pinch then. The pinch came in the year following the peace. James M. King.
In January of 1920, John L. Lewis, the eloquent, combative president of the United Mine Workers of America, announced a campaign to expand membership in southern West Virginia, especially Logan and Mingo counties.
Now is the logical time for this work. Every agency within the power of the coal operators is expected to be invoked to thwart the movement. But the campaign will be pushed through to the finish. John L. Lewis.
For coal operators, unionization couldn't have come at a worse time. The wartime boom in coal had collapsed, and fierce competition returned. Now the peace between operators and the union dissolved amidst strikes, layoffs, and evictions. At the center of the Union Drive in Mingo County was Matewan, an independent town on the site of the Hatfield-McCoy feud. At the center of Matewan was its 28-year-old chief of police, Albert Sidney Hatfield. He was thin and frail looking, but Sid Hatfield was anything but weak. He drank hard, gambled, and kept 2 pistols always by his side. Hatfield claimed to be a relative of Devil Anse, but wasn't. Jug ears gave him a boyish appearance. His wide grin showed off gold-capped teeth and led everyone to call him Smilin' Sid.
Sid was a uncouth, self-made person. He was rough, tough, and nasty. And when he got the job as chief police in Matewan, a lot of the better people, you can question that.
Matewan was an incorporated community. It was not a coal community. There's no police force in a coal company town. Matewan was a social center and service center for lots of company towns in the area. It was absolutely wide open. Trains of prostitutes coming down on the weekend. The town was for sale. To keep law and order in a town like that, you needed a man with a reputation, something like Sid Hatfield. The people in the town were scared of him. He was capable of mobilizing guns and people who would use them quickly. He was the voice of law and order in a place that needed it.
Now, Hatfield promised to protect miners who joined the union.
It was rather unusual in those days to find a law officer who sympathized with the union. He was the rare fella who stood for what I think is right, and that is the freedom to hold meetings and to talk, speak, and join groups that you want to join.
On the rainy morning of May 19th, 1920, 13 Baldwin Felts detectives arrived by train in Matewan, led by Albert Felts and his brother Lee. Almost immediately, the detectives began evicting families from houses owned by the Stone Mountain Coal Company. Word of the evictions spread quickly. As the detectives returned to the train depot, they were met by Sid Hatfield and a group of armed miners.
Sid approached the Phelps brothers, tried to place them under arrest. They tried to place him under arrest. Around them were miners with guns trained, ready to fight.
I was not there when the first shot was fired. My grandmother realized there was going to be trouble. She sent me home. I had walked up the railroad into my grandmother's home and had put my foot on the first step when there was 1,000 shots fired. sounded like war had begun. And I run through and my aunt was there. And I said, oh, Benny, mate one is blowed up. I thought everybody was murdered. And we run to the back. And you could see the back end of mate one, and you could see Tug River in that bend, the road there. Over 100 people run out of the city of mate one and swum that river into Kentucky.
When the shooting stopped, 7 detectives, including both Phelps brothers and 2 miners, lay dead. Also killed was Cabell Testerman, a plump jewelry store owner who was the town's mayor. As the 5 o'clock train pulled in, shocked passengers stared at all the bodies. A bloody stream flowed down the street.
The story of the Matewan battle was called into the Union office in Charleston, and one of the Union officers held his own hand and danced around. He was so happy to hear it.
Papers found on Al Phelps revealed a plan to bribe Sid Hatfield to turn against the Union. Hatfield, whose hat was shot off in the fight, boasted that he'd killed all the detectives. When he was charged with murder, Sid said he hadn't shot anyone. Two weeks later, Hatfield was arrested in a hotel room in Huntington with Jessie Testerman, the mayor's attractive and fashionable widow. The two were charged with improper relations, but released when they produced a marriage certificate. Tom Phelps, head of the Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency, blamed Hatfield for his brother's death, and also Mayor Testerman's. To gather evidence, Phelps sent an undercover agent, C.E. Lively, to Matewan. Lively opened a restaurant, rented out space to the Union, and began spying on Sid. At night, he wrote secret reports to Phelps under the code name Number 9. That spring, in a sensational trial, Lively testified against Sid. But Hatfield and 15 other defendants were found not guilty. One juror said he would sit until the dogwoods bloomed again before he'd convict a Matewan boy. After the trial, Sid and Jessie Hatfield took over Testerman's jewelry store. In addition to rings and bracelets, the store began selling guns and ammunition. Then, on August 1st, 1921, Tom Phelps got his revenge. On the courthouse steps in Welch, C.E. Lively and 6 detectives ambushed Sid and his boyhood friend, Ed Chambers. Lively killed Chambers with a bullet to the head. 5 shots struck Hatfield, sending his lifeless body tumbling down the steps. They shot Sid down like a dog said one miner. The murders sent shockwaves through the coal fields. Violence and wildcat strikes spread. Governor Ephraim Morgan declared martial law, ordered the arrest of union organizers, and dispatched all 100 members of the state police to Mingo County. In Matewan, 2,000 people attended Hatfield's and Chambers' funeral in a drenching rain. Even the heavens weep, said one mourner. As Sid's body was lowered into the ground, Jessie called out, "I'll never forget you, my sweetheart."
What's important is not who Sid Hatfield, the actual man, was, but who he became after his death. Sid Hatfield dead was someone who had finally, after so many years, stood up to the coal operators, and especially had stood up to the Baldwin Felts guards who had been brutalizing people for so long. I sort of see him as the John Brown of the mine wars. You can question his character or the methods that he chose, but he was the spark that set off this insurrection that then took on a life of its own.
Three weeks later, 5,000 miners, including veterans of Paint Creek, assembled near the northern border of Logan County. Many carried hunting rifles and hand grenades left over from World War I. The miners planned to march to Mingo County, where they would free those in jail and establish Union headquarters.
Every drop of blood and every dollar of the Union will be spent in the attempt to lift martial law in Mingo County. The only way to get your rights is with a high-powered rifle. If we meet any resistance, the Matewan affair will look like a sunbonnet parade. Frank Keeney.
Standing between the miners and Mingo was Don Chafin, a tough, belligerent lawman known as the King of Logan. No armed mob will cross Logan County, he vowed.
Don Chafin was the sheriff of Logan County, but he was much more than that. He had his own private army. He received money directly from the coal companies to fund it. He also was a protector of businesses in the same way that any organized crime outfit is. In other words, he would go to a business and say, "If you don't let me protect you, I'll break your kneecaps," that kind of thing. He ran his county with an iron fist. If you disagreed or got in the way, you were beaten or you were shot or you were thrown out.
Logan County is a leer in the face of liberty. A feudal barony defended by soldiers of fortune in the pay of mine owners. Winthrop Lane.
After pursuing one organizer all the way to Charleston, Chafin was shot 4 times in the chest by a Union vice president. He was back on the job the next week. To stop the miners' march, Chafin recruited 3,000 volunteers, including lawyers, bankers, and doctors.
When the call went out to Bluefield, it was, "Get your raincoats and machine guns and come on." A lot of the townspeople turned out at the train station. The troops marched through as heroes going off to war. The crowd parted. The men marched onto the train, and the train pulled out as the people waved goodbye and cheered. And this was going off to war. And this was the other side of West Virginia responding to the miners' march.
Chafin positioned his amateur army in trenches atop Blair Mountain on the road to Mingo. Meanwhile, the miners had begun to move. They commandeered automobiles at gunpoint, took over trains, and raided farms for food. The march grew to 15,000, forming a line 20 miles long. The time has come, said John Wilburn, a miner and Baptist minister, for me to lay down my Bible and pick up my rifle. To the tune of John Brown's Body, miners sang, "We'll hang Don Chafin from a sour apple tree." Many wore red bandanas and were soon known as rednecks.
At some point, people just have to stand up and say, this may not even be totally rational what I'm doing. To pick up your rifle and try to overthrow the government of a county, but yet you do it anyway. At some point, people just have to say, enough is enough. I have to do this to keep my human dignity, whether it succeeds or not. And I think that was the sort of spirit that march grew out of.
On the morning of August 31st, 70 miners led by John Wilburn met 3 guards from Chafin's army at Blair Mountain. Each side asked for a secret password, then realized they were enemies and began shooting. All 3 guards and 1 miner were killed. Fighting spread along a 10-mile front. Despite its smaller numbers, Chafin's army held its position. "I never experienced anything like that battle," said a veteran of World War I. "Bullets were hissing back and forth all around our heads." For 3 days, heavy gunfire echoed from Blair Mountain. But both sides were unorganized and ineffective. Governor Morgan appealed to Washington for help. President Warren Harding sent 2,000 federal troops, including a chemical warfare unit and a squadron of bombers. As federal troops reached Blair Mountain, Chafin's army disbanded. Almost immediately, miners began laying down their arms. Many said they could not bring themselves to shoot at soldiers in the U.S. Army. The Battle of Blair Mountain was America's largest insurrection since the Civil War, yet only 12 miners and 4 of Chafin's men were killed.
It was a defeat for the miners, really. They didn't get to Mingo County. They didn't change much. What they did get, and it was the only thing they got in my estimation, was they got the nation's attention. People in West Virginia and around the country learned about them, learned of their lives and their frustrations, and they sat up and took notice of these West Virginia miners for a little while.
There's a myth that people in West Virginia have been very passive and haven't stood up for themselves and haven't tried to deal with their problems. During the mine wars, people risked their lives, they risked their families, they risked their children's lives. They went through an incredible amount of suffering to stand up and say, I'm a human being and I'm an American citizen and I deserve the same treatment as any other American citizen.
Hundreds of miners and union officials were arrested. 54, including Keeney and Mooney, were tried for murder and treason in the Jefferson County Courthouse in Charlestown, where John Brown had been convicted on similar charges. Several miners, including Reverend John Wilburn, were found guilty of murder and sentenced to prison. The other defendants were acquitted. When Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney squabbled with Union President John L. Lewis over the strike, Lewis replaced them. The two tried to form their own union, but it failed, and both men left the labor movement for good. Inside the courthouse, where he had shot Hatfield and Chambers, C.E. Lively was acquitted of murder on the grounds of self-defense. He left the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency and found work in a non-union coal mine. Jesse Hatfield married a state policeman, divorced him, and married a fourth husband, then lived to the age of 82. Don Chafin served 2 years in prison for selling illegal liquor. After his release, he became a lobbyist for the coal industry and died a wealthy man. In October 1922, the UMWA officially called off the strike in the southern coal fields. Victorious coal companies tore up union contracts and began hiring non-union workers. Union membership in West Virginia dropped from 50,000 to only 600 by the end of the decade. Coal miners everywhere struggled to find work. In the 1920s, state officials proudly launched a $50 million road building campaign with the slogan, "Help pull West Virginia out of the mud."
West Virginia was caught up in some of the change that was taking place in the country. It was a decade of tremendous change. The building of the roads had tremendous impact on local communities. I think it reoriented even the way people lived and where people lived. People came down from their mountain homes so they could be closer to the roads, which meant they were closer to civilization.
When the new road was finished, new houses and new schoolhouses were built alongside it. Back in the hills, the old houses and schoolhouses rotted down. Blackberry vines crept over the broken porches, and the eyeless windows stared out at the encroaching wilderness. Louise McNeil.
There is a restless flocking to the towns and big cities. We will soon have a large disinherited population. They sell their farms for what they can get. Where they can get nothing, they abandon them. Thomas Quirk.
The automobile transformed West Virginia's cities and towns. Wheeling, Huntington, Charleston, and dozens of smaller towns expanded, adding movie theaters, department stores, and middle-class neighborhoods. Families built homes with telephones, electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating. Comforts rare or non-existent in rural areas. An impressive new state capital summed up the confidence urban West Virginians were feeling. Nothing reflected prosperity more than a massive new hotel, the Greenbrier, at White Sulphur Springs. Here, European royalty and Hollywood stars mixed with affluent West Virginians, including coal operators who held their annual meetings at the hotel. Guests competed at America's newest craze, golf. At night, they slipped away to casinos and speakeasies nestled discreetly on the edges of the resort. Nothing changed as much in the 1920s as opportunities for women. More women than ever before worked outside the home, attended school, started professional careers. Teacher Fanny Cobb Carter of Charleston became the first black newspaper woman in West Virginia and a leader in the fight against illiteracy. In 1922, 2 years after women received the vote, Izetta Jewel Brown, an actress and suffragette from Kingwood, became the first woman in the South to run for the United States Senate. The following year, a 14-year-old girl in Roane County was arrested for wearing pants, a violation of a local law banning females from dressing in anything that impersonates male attire. The next day, she and 3 girlfriends paraded through the town in forbidden clothing. The issue, pants or no pants, dominated the town's next election. No pants politicians lost.
For blacks in West Virginia in the 1920s, the situation was better than in some neighboring states and certainly better than in the Deep South. And in the coal mining counties, particularly in the southern part of the state, where there were substantial numbers of blacks, they had a political impact. There were state institutions which were established, which spoke to the needs of the black citizens of the state. The downside of race relations, and I think where one has to be careful about claiming exceptionality for race relations in West Virginia, is the fact that we know the Ku Klux Klan was very active in the state in the 1920s.
Somebody told me that his father had been a shoe repairman, and at that time the Ku Klux Klan was becoming quite active in their town. And he said that when they went down to watch the Ku Klux Klan parades, they knew who all the people were, although they were covered with sheets and they couldn't see their faces, because they recognized the shoes, because the shoes had been brought into their shop for repair.
I sold the Cincinnati Post when I was a little boy, and I saved up $7. I put that $7 in a bank at Matoka, West Virginia. The bank went under, and I haven't seen my $7 since. The Depression hit everybody hard. We didn't have much, didn't expect much. We lived close to the earth, close to the ground, close to the soil. I'd hear my mom praying at night after we turned out the kerosene lamp and went to bed. Those were days in which, in some weeks, there was no work in the coal mining community.
The Great Depression hit West Virginia as hard as anywhere in America.
Men worked for nothing, and they had nothing. It was very hard living. When beans was 10 cents a pound, and bread was 5 cents a loaf, but who had it? Who had a dime to buy beans, and who had a nickel to buy bread? Very few had it. They lived hard, and they didn't raise it, they didn't have it. We would go down to the railroad track, and we would walk along the railroad track and pick up lumps of coal. And each one of us would fill our bag as much as we could carry, probably a third or a fourth of the way. And we would bring it home because we had no central heat in the house. We had fireplaces. That was tough, really tough.
Men desperate for work in 1930 were drawn to Hawk's Nest, a scenic cliff in the New River Gorge, where Union Carbide Chemists Corporation began digging a giant tunnel through Gauley Mountain. The tunnel would divert water to the company's hydroelectric generating station 3 miles downstream. Fearing interference by the Federal Power Authority, Union Carbide pressed its contractors to complete the tunnel in record time. Contractors hired 3,000 men, the majority African American, to drill through rock that was almost pure silica. Basic safety precautions, such as wet drilling, were ignored. Fine silica particles filled the air, becoming trapped in workers' lungs and making breathing difficult.
They didn't allow any water on the bench drills. The drilling there had to be dry drilling because otherwise they couldn't drill fast enough. A fellow could drill 3 holes dry to 1 wet. The boss was always telling us, hurry, hurry, hurry. George Robinson.
Every morning, in the camp above the tunnel, armed men forced the sick out of bed. Those too weak to work were run out of town by the local sheriff.
These companies involved in it thought that they could get this job done quickly, and they probably didn't have a lot of regard for the people who were being hurt by it. The result was great numbers of workers came down with silicosis, and great numbers of workers died. It was one of the great industrial disasters in the history of this country.
Men died, said one worker, in the camps, under rocks, and every place else. Many bodies were buried in unmarked graves near the tunnel opening.
A committee of Congress has just started to investigate the building of Hawk's Nest Tunnel, known as the Village of Death. I personally believe that 2,000 men are doomed to die as a result of ruthless destruction of life by American industry.
Congressional hearings failed to assign blame for the deaths, and the issue was soon dropped. Few people wanted to discuss the tragedy, said West Virginia Senator Rush Holt, because of the danger of stepping on the toes of some industrialist. An estimated 764 men, including 581 blacks, died digging the tunnel at Hawk's Nest. In 1935, the year the project was completed, Hawk's Nest became one of West Virginia's first state parks. Tourists flocked to the grand overlook. Far below, the tunnel opening was barely visible. Nowhere were times harder during the Depression than in a group of coal camps lining Scott's Run, a creek outside Morgantown. Few of the area's 10,000 residents held a steady job.
Scott's Run provided kind of a symbol for what went wrong in West Virginia. Early in the 20th century, great numbers of people were brought in, both mountaineers who came down from their farms and people from many different countries to mine the coal at the various coal operations along Scott's Run. In time, the Scott's Run companies found difficulty marketing their coal. They found they had too many miners to mine the coal that they could sell. And so you had a situation where there were great numbers of people kind of captured or stuck in an area.
One writer called Scott's Run the damnedest cesspool of human misery I have ever seen in America.
I was 8 when we moved to Scott's Run. You felt lost when you got down into that spot. The trains were constantly shifting and moving up and down there full of coal. The hillsides were lined with houses. The creek was an orange color. It was full of garbage. That part of my life is colored in not bright colors, but in that grays and blacks and browns. In the center there are some bright yellow spots. That was the families. We get around inside at night and sat around the old stove.
December 8. Went to the store to get some bread for a family of 6 children that had nothing to eat. The father has been out of work for 2 months. Only 2 of the children have shoes. The mother has been married 5 years and is 20 years old. Oh, the pity of it. Mary Boehner.
22-year-old Mary Boehner, the bright, energetic daughter of a Presbyterian minister in Clarksburg, had dreamed of doing social work overseas. But her father convinced her to look closer to home. She was hired to open a church mission in Scotts Run.
My mom was really shocked. She had never seen so much poverty. Newspapers on the walls. No clothes for kids, no shoes. Sickness, bed bugs. She would wash lice out of people's hair, children's hair, after she got to know them better. Hopelessness. There was no food, no money. I mean, if you lost your job, you had nothing. There was no hope.
Little Audrey said his father was real sick, and how they got 80 cents a day for his father's janitor service at the 2 schoolhouses. Now little Audrey has to do the janitor service. Once in a while, food gets scarce, he said. When I think of my $30 budget a month for meals, I feel like 2 cents.
Boehner converted an abandoned company store into a community center called The Shack. She turned a walk-in refrigerator into a shower, filled dusty store shelves with books. Boehner taught children about health and nutrition, formed a community choir, and created the county's first black Girl Scout troop. She urged families to plant gardens and raise their own food. But when Boehner asked coal companies to donate seeds, they refused.
These companies have no regard for human life. They tear men to pieces, then let them go to die.
I can remember Dad and Mother saying, "Why is she here? What's she doing? And why did she come? Who sent her?" But then we saw what she was doing. Here was a woman, a very young woman, who was directing all sorts of things. She was not just saying, "God loves you." She was going out and showing people. She was bringing clothing. She was bringing food. She was sending people out to help people. And it made a real impression on me to see this young woman, what she was doing.
Even though Scotts Run was only 9 miles away from Morgantown, it was a world of difference that many people were afraid to cross. So she put the kids on a bus and she took them into town. And one of the people told me much later, he said, "When your mom took us to have lunch at a restaurant, we were very scared. And she taught us that we could do this. And this was the first time we'd sat down and ordered from a menu, but we were all very scared." she made them believe in themselves. She gave them new opportunities.
Mary Boehner was soon joined by others. The Quakers opened a factory where unemployed miners made what were called God-love chairs. Students from West Virginia University taught Sunday school classes and helped serve free meals. Then, in 1933, a woman who had bought a God-love chair arrived. She met with Mary Boehner, visited several families, and saw conditions in the camps for herself. The next day, Eleanor Roosevelt returned to Washington and told her husband that something had to be done about Scott's Run.
She was convinced that what needed to be done was to take these excess people out of the mines at Scott's Run and find some way to give them a livelihood where they could work at something different and get out of this completely dead-end situation that they were in. Let's take these people and let's put them on the land. Let's let them be farmers. And if they can't earn enough by farming, let's bring in some manufacturing. And out of that, I think, was born the idea of Arthurdale.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt put his wife's idea into action. The federal government bought a farm 20 miles from Scott's Run, built new houses, and began selecting families for relocation to the new community of Arthurdale. Applicants were asked if they got along with their neighbors, if they had ever used farm tools, and if they could tell a rooster from a hen. Blacks and foreign-born whites were excluded. Colored people do not make much of an effort on their own, said one official, and foreigners are even worse. Families from Scott's Run began moving to Arthurdale in the summer of 1934.
The day that it came real to us was when the truck came down to pick up our furniture and take us up on the hill. And we got up there, and there was this little white house. All around it was green grass. There were trees behind it, silhouetted against the most beautiful blue sky. Our lives changed completely overnight.
A school and cooperative store opened, as did factories where workers made vacuum cleaners and furniture. Reporters from across the country arrived to see Eleanor's experiment. It got so a man couldn't set down to his sow belly and turnip greens, complained one resident, without some stranger peeking in the window to ask fool questions. Arthurdale was the first of nearly 200 New Deal resettlement projects, but its planned economy fizzled. Factory goods weren't profitable enough. Food production less than what was needed.
Arthurdale didn't accomplish what it set out to accomplish. The efforts to bring in manufacturing to Arthurdale failed. What manufacturer wanted to go out to a remote location like Arthurdale? It didn't make economic sense. Moreover, the farmland at Arthurdale turned out not to be very good land. They had picked bad land. They did a lot of foolish things. Economically, it didn't work in the long term.
Government support of Arthur Dale dwindled. Yet Eleanor Roosevelt returned every year and continued to declare the project a complete success.
She cared. We couldn't imagine that the president's wife would come down here. You couldn't love her enough. You can't tell anybody that grew up in Arthurdale that it was a failure. No, it was our savior. We really got the good life. It depends on what you call the good life. But good life is having shelter and clothing, food. Our dream was to have a home of our own. It was a success for us.
Listen to the mill whistle. It's wheeling steel. On the dawn of a new year, this is the Wheeling Steel family broadcast from the headquarters city of the Wheeling Steel Corporation, Wheeling, West Virginia, with music by the...
On January 2nd, 1938, it's Wheeling Steel, a live radio program from the Capitol Theater in Wheeling, premiered coast to coast on the Mutual Network.
Welcome thousands of our family. We extend also a hearty welcome to you other friends of Wheeling Steel, our customers and your families. For your enjoyment, it's Wheeling Steel.
There was nothing on the airwaves quite like it.
Headliner appearances on these programs are made by members of Wheeling Steel families or men and women right out of the mills, the factories, or the offices of the corporation. These are not acclaimed radio performers. Many in the course of these broadcasts will face the microphone for the first time. Others can claim a limited experience. In every case, their sincere efforts are to please their vast radio audience.
The stars at night are big.
Among the amateur stars were the Steele sisters, a trio of high school girls.
Sky is wide and high. We joined the Navy to see the world, and when we see, we saw the sea. We saw the Pacific.
The Singing Millmen.
But the Atlantic is romantic, and the Pacific isn't what it's cracked up to be.
And Sarah Ream, the singing stenographer. The show was the brainchild of John Grimes, Wheeling Steel's director of advertising. Grimes had first proposed the idea in 1931, but company executives were skeptical. Then, Wheeling, like other blue-collar towns in the 1930s, was divided by labor troubles. Soon after Wheeling Steel signed a union contract with steel workers in 1937, the company gave Grimes the go-ahead. A radio show could plug company products and perhaps rekindle the feeling that Wheeling Steel was one big family.
they got the idea of the family broadcast. And it wasn't very hard to do because Wheeling has always been a very musical city. Every little nightclub in town had a band, and practically everybody in Wheeling either worked for Wheeling Steel or had a father or mother or uncle or aunt working for Wheeling Steel.
Open auditions drew hundreds of hopeful stars.
The other night, dear, as I lay sleeping,
Included were a mill worker's 3 teenage daughters, Janet, Margaret June, and Betty Jane Evans.
I was mistaken.
My parents were very musical. My mother played the piano. My father sang. Everybody in the family sang. We used to have a saying in our house. And the night shall be filled with music, and the cares that infest the day shall fold their tents like the Arabs and silently slip away. That was our family philosophy. Don't worry when you go to bed tonight, because that's already over with, and you can't do anything about it. Let's look forward to tomorrow. And we did that.
It's Wheeling Steel was an overnight hit. Life magazine published a glamorous photo essay on the cast. The show broadcast from the 1939 World's Fair in New York, then joined the NBC Blue Network. Millions of Americans tuned in every Sunday afternoon.
If your heart goes bumpity-bump, it's love, love, love. If your throat comes up the lump, it's love, love, love.
My mother was so proud. Did you see my girls on the radio? She always used to say. And we were just plunged into a brand new whole life that people just don't expect to ever have happened to them in a small town like Wheeling.
We conclude the Wheeling Steel program earlier than usual today in order that we may hear the voice of the President of the United States.
Then, on December 7th, 1941, It's Wheeling Steel was suddenly preempted by an announcement from President Roosevelt. America was at war.
Forces of the Empire of Japan.
A second world war changed everyone's lives once again.
One little wagon, a khaki-covered cutie. One little wagon, relieved the man for duty.
Coal miners were called back to work. Women hired on to keep mills and factories operating. Chemical plants along the Kanawha River expanded to meet the need for explosives and synthetic rubber. In White Sulphur Springs, the U.S. State Department rented the Greenbrier to house enemy diplomats. The nation's first 5-star internment camp. Wheeling Steel converted its mills to weapons production and its radio show into a patriotic arm of the war effort.
Just heard the regular Sunday program by employees of the Wheeling Steel Corporation in the city that produces many of the needs of the American way of life, including music and song. This program is also broadcast by shortwave to the American Expeditionary Forces throughout the world. From United States war bonds and stamps to victory, Wheeling means business.
It's Wheeling Steel hit the road, playing at war bond rallies across the country.
Oh my heavens, in 4 years we sang so many songs. Everything was oriented to the war, like Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, and You Better Give Me Lots of Lovin', Honey, while your honey's still around. Miss You.
They Think of me, lonely me, thinking of you, trying to smile away my tears. By and by, you and I will start anew. We'll know again those happy years. I miss you since you went away, dear. Miss you more than I can say, dear. Daytime, nighttime, nothing I do can make me forget that I still love you. Kiss you in my dreams, I kiss you, whispering, darling, how I miss you. Tell me, do you ever miss me as I miss you?
Then, in 1944, John Grimes' health began to fail, and Wheeling Steel abruptly canceled its radio program. On June 18th, its Wheeling Steel went on the air for the last time.
Direct from the stage of the Capitol Theater in Wheeling, West Virginia. And here is Carlo Ross.
Got a feeling I'll be stealing back to Wheeling, West VA.
We didn't know it was going to end. It was terrible because it was an end of an era for all of us that had been on. The song we sang was We'll Meet Again, don't know where, don't know when. And everybody on the stage was in tears. It was just awful. Even the audience was crying.
Musicians returned to local bands. Secretaries and steel workers to the mill. The Evans sisters went home, where they resumed a more normal life. But they never stopped singing.
Goodbye, everybody.
I was born and grew up in a coal camp, which occupied all the valley space. And other than that, the only place you could live was a holler. And you live in the only flat space available. And then you're just surrounded by the mountains. Flat spaces make me very uncomfortable. I need some of that sort of comfort of hemming me around with those mountains. And when you grow up like that, that's how you come to see the world, is ringed with mountains. And without them, I think you lose your balance. I think you lose your perspective.
In post-war America, coal was still king, which made a coal strike a potential national crisis. Beginning in 1946, Union coal miners were called out in a series of dramatic strikes by the man they had come to worship, John Llewellyn Lewis.
If we must grind up human flesh and bones in the industrial machine that we call modern America, then before God I assert that those who consume the coal and you and I who benefit from that service because we live in comfort, we owe protection to those men first, and we owe the security for their families if they die. I say it, I voice it, I proclaim it, and I care not who in heaven or hell opposes it.
A union organizer from Iowa who had spent little time in a coal mine, Lewis overwhelmed friends and enemies alike. Lewis's head, wrote a reporter, is the most impressive affair I have ever seen on top of a man's neck. Lewis scowled so often that pictures of him smiling became collector's items. Since seizing control of the UMWA in 1919, Lewis had become the most widely feared labor leader in America. One congressman called him a bushy-browed Hitler. "Think of me as a coal miner," replied Lewis, "and you won't make any mistakes."
At the White House, John L. Lewis, Union head, and Federal Coal Administrator J.A. Krug, with his Chief Deputy, Vice Admiral Morrell, conduct the negotiations which mean good news to consumers. The end of the strike, which shut down soft coal mines on April 1st and threatened a tie-up of all industry. All through the soft coal regions, miners await the word to return on completion of the compromise agreement. Everybody's happy.
By 1950, Lewis had secured miners a contract better than any they had ever seen, including health benefits, a guaranteed pension, and higher wages. But the gains came at a price. The contract allowed operators to further mechanize their mines. Continuous mining machines replaced whole crews of men and spewed clouds of coal dust into the air.
What will a coal miner do? Tell me, what will a coal miner do?
Thousands more miners came down with black lung, a disease resembling silicosis, with equally fatal results.
Tell me, what will a coal miner do? Miners' poor pocketbooks are growing lean.
Black miners were the first to lose their jobs. Mine foremen refused to train blacks to operate machinery. They would envy the machine, claimed one foreman, and not work well. During the 1950s, a decade of national prosperity, more than half of the coal miners in West Virginia lost their jobs. Coal operators sold off company stores and houses, closed down company towns.
When I was 13, the coal company that my father worked for was sold, and my father lost his job, and we lost our house and had to move. Many people move from one job to another, but they can always go back to where they grew up often and point to where they grew up and say, well, this is the old neighborhood. When I go back, there's a field where my town was. There's a field of weeds and nothing left. When I go to see the old movie theater, it's not there anymore. Any of the places I used to hang out, the swimming pool I used to go to is now a hole in the ground. There's nothing left. I don't think I've ever quite gotten over that, and I think that's probably true for a lot of people. It's like being a refugee in your own state.
I remember the day when my father packed up the family car and put all of the kids in the car and furniture on top of the car and joined the trek of others along Route 21 heading to the promised land in Ohio because there were no jobs to be had at home. It was a very difficult decision for young men and women of that generation to make, to have to leave the land that had become part of them.
As their communities disappeared, many families drifted north to cities such as Detroit and Cincinnati in search of work. Blacks left the state at 3 times the rate whites did.
For people who moved out of state, it was an environment that was openly hostile, where neighbors didn't want you there, where neighbors made fun of you, where when you went to school, the other children made fun of you, made fun of the way you talked and where you were from. It's really hard on anybody. I think that's true for poor West Virginians who left, and it's also true for middle-class West Virginians who left as well.
In 1953, newly elected Governor William Marland made a stunning proposal: a stiff new tax on coal. A former miner, Marland said that outside interests had exploited the state for 50 years, leaving behind a scarred landscape, yet few tax dollars. We are paying a fearful price to allow coal to be extracted from the hills of West Virginia, he declared. It is only right that we should be able to point with pride to better roads and schools as a result of this awful toll.
In West Virginia, the big coal barons had run the state for years, and he came in and right off called for this severance tax on coal and just about blew their mind. I mean, these guys were saying, what? It's like they felt that they owned the legislature. You know, I mean, they would pay for all this and pay for all that, and how dare this guy come in and do that? It's like striking mom and dad or something.
Coal operators lobbied fiercely against the tax, saying it would cripple the state's leading industry, and the state legislature rejected it soundly. Marland's proposals for other taxes were defeated as well. Marland was successful in desegregating West Virginia's public schools beginning in 1954, despite the objections of several southern counties.
We took the position that the Supreme Court's ruling was the law of the land, that as such we should obey it in both spirit and word. To this end we have worked, and I'm glad to say that those who have studied the segregation and integration program of the public schools of the nation have been loud in their praise of West Virginia's efforts in this field.
Marland did not get most of the things that he asked for. He never did come to peace with the coal operators in the state, who never forgave him. The only problem was he had a personal drinking problem, which he later admitted. He started to feel like a failure when in fact probably he wasn't, and his drinking problem tended to get worse.
Frustrated and weakened by alcoholism, William Marland joined the exodus from West Virginia in 1959. Reporters later found him in Chicago, driving a taxi. On February 7, 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts arrived in Charleston to register as a candidate in West Virginia's presidential primary. Kennedy needed a victory in West Virginia. A wealthy Roman Catholic, he had to prove that he could win in a blue-collar Protestant state. For 6 weeks, Kennedy crisscrossed the mountains, promising federal help for West Virginia if he was elected.
Well, of course, this state has been hard hit. In fact, probably more hard hit than any state in the Union. There are about 250,000 people in West Virginia on surplus food. What I think the most significant thing is that most of these people have been put out of work because machines have taken their place. What's happened in West Virginia is going to happen in many states of the Union unless the federal government begins to recognize that this is a great national problem to which we've devoted very little attention.
Well, now, one of the things which we send abroad is...
He had studied up on the state. He liked to learn more by going down into coal mines, by visiting schools. And on one occasion, when the school kids were getting their lunches, he noticed that one of the students was not eating his. And he went over to ask him why. And that student simply said that he had to bring that lunch home to his family. And this made a very deep impression on John F. Kennedy. And it made him the kind of president who never forgot West Virginia.
When John Kennedy came to campaign in West Virginia, he saw conditions that clearly shocked him, that made it difficult for him to believe that these conditions survived in mid-century America.
In May, Kennedy won an impressive victory in West Virginia. He said later that it was the most important step on his road to the White House. As president, Kennedy moved quickly to fulfill his campaign promises, sending surplus food for needy families and federal funds for 2 new highways. On June 20th, 1963, Kennedy returned for the state's centennial celebration in Charleston, where he spoke in a pouring rain.
The sun does not always shine in West Virginia, but the people always do. And I'm delighted to be here. This state was born to turmoil, but I know of no state, and I know this state well, whose people feel more strongly, who have a greater sense of pride in themselves, in their state, and in their country than the people of West Virginia. And I'm proud to be here today.
It was his last visit to West Virginia. The same primary that catapulted Kennedy toward the White House launched William Wallace Barron into the State House. A charismatic politician who preferred the name Wally, Barron led the most corrupt administration the state had ever seen.
Wally Barron was a fairly effective governor when he was in office, but corruption took over. I mean, he used to have a little jar on his desk, and people would go in to see him, and he wouldn't tell you to put money in it, but somebody else would say, if you go in, you know, you might drop a 20 in there, or 10, or something like this, you know.
13 members of Barron's administration were convicted of bribery, conspiracy, or tax evasion. Barron was found guilty of jury tampering and became the first governor sent to prison. I might have married Wally, a former girlfriend once said, but I would never vote for him.
My coal miner dad took me to Beckley one evening in the back of a large old truck. That was a payday. He bought a fiddle for me. Then when I ran for the House of Delegates, I knew a lawyer friend up in Beckley, and he said, "Now, Robert, take that violin with you. Play a tune. They'll remember you." That's what I did. Everywhere I went, I took that violin, and I played a tune. And if I found two persons who wanted to hear a tune, I'd play it for them. That's how I fiddled in that first race and won the House of Delegates. I was an unknown. But with that violin, I opened doors.
In 1965, Senator Robert Byrd joined President Lyndon Johnson in launching a massive federal aid program for Appalachia, a mountainous region spread across 13 states, including all of West Virginia. A year earlier, Johnson had declared a national war on poverty. Now, Appalachia would become a major battleground. Workers from Vista, volunteers in service to America, arrived in West Virginia to assist anti-poverty programs. Local politicians charged that they were outside agitators sent in to teach communism. "They are dirty and nasty," said one official, "and they won't shave." One volunteer came from an unlikely lineage, John D. Rockefeller IV, known as Jay. In Mingo County, Vista workers joined a program run by a local high school teacher, Huey Perry.
Mingo had a reputation of being one of the crookedest political counties in the whole United States. The local politicians controlled the welfare system, the Board of Education. The politicians were the economy. It was serfdom. It was a little kingdom. And the people were the subjects. There was no democracy in Mingo County. What we attempted to do was to talk with the poor people up the creeks and the hollows and to organize them into what we call community action groups, to organize the people so that they could speak for themselves rather than being spoken for. We had all the kids that had health problems. They were running around in the front yard, playing in the creeks, wearing a diaper. And we really started a preschool program. It was the first full-day preschool program run by people who were in poverty. The program in Mingo County, that early program that we developed, became the model for Head Start programs throughout the rest of the nation.
This is the road, if you can call it that leads
Following the trail of federal dollars into Appalachia were the national media.
tens of thousands of roads like this, winding back along the creeks and hollows of 11 states. And beside these roads, the shacks of tar paper and pine, which are the homes of 1 million permanently poor. Up on the hill is the Pert Creek School. And up there, on this one day, is the only sign anywhere in this hollow that it is Christmas in Appalachia.
Christmas in Appalachia. A CBS News special report.
There were people who came to West Virginia with their story already in mind. They came with the idea of presenting the picture of a state that was a poverty-stricken state with its people running around barefoot, and I resented it. They were bent upon portraying the sad lives of people who had lived in hard times, people who were patriotic, people who were God-fearing, people who lived near the soil, and people who worked hard. They wanted to work. They weren't looking for a handout.
The image started to get formed in the 1960s that West Virginians ran around in their bare feet, that they had no family structure of any type, that they didn't have any food. We had reporters coming in here from all over the country, and they would want to see poor people, and like they didn't exist somewhere else, you know. So we were always kind of fighting this, and I must confess that we used to send them at the newspaper all down to the same bar down in East Bank, and there were the same 4 miners would always be there to be interviewed all the time. You know, we used to laugh about it. But that got annoying to people in West Virginia. They started getting a little bit sensitive. People lived just like they did anywhere else.
There are, in effect, 2 West Virginias. There is the West Virginia of Charleston, with its average family income, one of the high in the East. And there is the West Virginia of Kelly's Creek, where men who have not worked since the mine closed in 1952 sit on the porch and stare sad-faced and gentle-eyed at the scarred hillside. It is the second West Virginia that casts a painful shadow over the prosperous, growing West Virginia. New York Times.
In order to eliminate problems, we first had to admit that there were problems. We did not try to hide the poverty that was there. And there was criticism from a lot of sources about we are tearing West Virginia's image down. But this was West Virginia. There was lack of ever opportunity. And so if the outhouses and all the garbage, all the shacks showed up on the national television screen, then we felt that was helpful to the state and not harmful to the state.
Goldie Johnson cooks for 7. Her 3 children, her daughter's husband, and her granddaughter of 2 1/2, besides herself and Calvin Johnson. In the yard, there are the dead outlines of a flower garden Goldie Johnson tried to keep one forgotten spring and then gave up on. She has worked hard every day of her marriage, and there is nothing conceivable that can stop her work as long as she lives. And she knows now it will have to be a life without flowers.
There are a lot of politicians in West Virginia who resented the fact that we were shining a searchlight on the conditions of poverty. But that is the only way that those conditions could have been improved. And this was absolutely necessary in order to get the necessary support and financing and to understand why poverty exists in West Virginia.
As the war on poverty expanded, local politicians seized control of federal programs in West Virginia.
The number of people participating in the community action groups grew and grew, and it scared the politicians. And I think the thing that summed it up well was when a community leader with his bullhorn spoke to the county commission, and to paraphrase him, he says, over in old England, if they didn't like you, if the king didn't like you, they would cut off your head. He says over here, if they don't like you, they'll cut off your project. And this was what was happening.
Community action groups dissolved. In 1970, Huey Perry resigned and left Mingo County.
The legacy of the war on poverty is a rather mixed legacy. It helped to bring conditions that had not been addressed to the national agenda. It also springboarded West Virginia to the forefront as a symbol of the other America, a region of poverty and laziness, images and stereotypes that folk from the mountains had struggled against and fought against for generations.
It was a decade of change. Civil rights demonstrators pressured state officials into banning segregation in parks, theaters, and restaurants. Coal miners threw out the corrupt union leaders who had succeeded John L. Lewis. After a tragic mine explosion at Farmington, they won stronger mine safety laws and compensation for victims of black lung. But a grassroots campaign to end strip mining failed. Nearly a third of West Virginia's coal now came from surface mines, which employed fewer workers and left a greater impact on the land. At many sites, mine waste, called slag or gob, was poured across creeks, forming dams that impounded water. Despite warnings that gob-piled dams were unreliable, they were unregulated and mostly ignored. Until Buffalo Creek.